Hello, in this video we're going to talk about different kinds of research and research questions and the kind of evidence for such types of research. Sounds a bit dry, but it's actually helpful to understanding different fields that you might be doing writing in. So more in this video. Okay, welcome back. Professor Kent Lee here. I'm going to talk about types of research questions and evidence that you deal with in papers, either papers that you are writing or maybe papers that you are reading to use as sources for papers that you are writing in college. And we want to talk about maybe the different kinds of questions in different fields and how they ask questions differently, because that shapes the kind of data or support that one uses in those fields, which then really shapes the way that one writes papers in those fields. So let's take a field of study, and I say field, not major. Sometimes college majors are really broad and really contain multiple fields. For example, if you study a language, if you're a language major, foreign language major, for example, it's actually pretty broad because you might actually be interested in a particular field within that major. It might be literature in the language. It might be theoretical linguistics. It might be applied linguistics or language education. Maybe culture and media studies, or maybe business, things like business English, business applications. So we need to distinguish those because those are actually very different. And papers are going to be very different in these different fields. Affects how you write papers and your objectives, your purposes, the kind of audience and the style and all of that in writing. So I'm going to take linguistics as an example because it's something I know and it's actually pretty broad even in itself as a field. By the way, linguistics is a social science. It is about a social phenomenon, language. And maybe at the college level, it might seem more humanities-like, but really when you get into studying at the graduate level and such, it's really more of a social science because you use social science research methods to study language. So it's really a social science. So I'm going to take that. So let's pretend, for example, that maybe you're interested in linguistics. At least, okay, I am, but just as an example, let's say you're a linguist, but you suddenly wake up one day and maybe some time traveler has gone back in time and messed up things, and there's no linguistics. Or maybe you somehow go back in time in the past where there's no linguistics, and so maybe you and your friends who are also linguists, let's say you're interested in studying linguistics and there's no linguistics. We've got sociology, psychology, education studies, but for some reason, okay, something's happened and there's no linguistics in this universe. So if you're just starting this new field of linguistics, what questions would you ask? How would you go about doing research? What would you study? How would you study it? What are different ways of conducting research on linguistics? What are different kinds of questions you would ask, and how would you study those questions? It's actually quite broad, quite varied. It's going to depend really maybe on your background or your interest, your goals, your objectives. What are your goals or your objectives? It's going to matter a lot. You could ask questions about how language works in the mind, or how people learn language or languages, or things like that. For example, you could approach it from maybe kind of a literature perspective, and maybe a social perspective, and okay, think about language as a communication system. Well, how does language work as a communication system? How do people express and convey specific types of ideas, and what kind of grammar forms go with those ideas? Or you could just focus on the grammar and understanding the grammar of the language more in depth, more in detail, and asking questions about the grammar. That could take you into more of a philosophical approach. The way a philosopher might approach this is asking, well, how does the grammar work as a logical system? Well, what's the logic, underlying logic and system behind the grammar of the language or languages? Or a philosopher might ask, great, what about semantics or word meanings? What do we mean by meaning? What is meaning, and how does it work in words, and how do words have different meanings in different context? You could approach it with the mindset of a historian and ask, okay, where did these languages come from? What's their history? How did they come about? And maybe are some of them related to each other? You could approach it as maybe a sociologist or an anthropologist and ask, what's the connection between language and culture? How do different groups use language differently? How does language reflect things like social class, power, identity? Or what about different dialects? Why do different dialects exist? And how do people perceive those dialects and the people who speak them? You could approach it from the perspective of education, how to teach language to children, how to teach language to adults, and what works best. You could approach it from the perspective of a psychologist. For example, how do people use and understand language as a mental thing? That is, how does language work in the mind? The mind is more like the software. Okay, what are the mental aspects? How do people process language in their brains? How do they store it? How does it work in the brain? And you can, well, or actually in the mind. And if you go to the brain, then that's more of the hardware level. So a psychologist would focus on language in the mind, but a neurologist or neuroscientist or biologist would think about the biology behind it, the hardware, the brain, what parts of the brain are used for language or different language functions, and how much and how do they connect together. And those are some different kinds of questions. And so the kind of data you're going to deal with will be different, and the kind of research methods and analysis, and within the paragraphs of your paper, the kind of support you have. Each paragraph has like a main idea. Well, what kind of support are you going to have behind that main idea? What kind of data or information is going to use to support your ideas, your claims? It could be theoretical. For example, if you're approaching it from a philosophical approach, it might be more of a theoretical kind of task, where you deal with just the object itself, like hypothetical sentences, or hypothetical examples of word meanings, and asking questions about that, and using logic and logical argumentation to kind of analyze, to tear things apart and compare things and come up with some insights. Or you could go out and collect data. So if you collect data, that's empirical. You actually go out and you collect data beyond just the object that you're studying. Collect data about how people use or do things, whether it's real world data or it's in a laboratory. You collect data. That is called empirical research. Now, the data that you collect might be more structured data if you're taking more of a scientific approach and using scientific methods to collect data. It could be more structured data. So structured means it's in like rows and columns, like in a spreadsheet, and you've got like numbers and for different things you've measured, or for some things you might have categories. You have these different factors or variables that you're looking at that are the columns and rows of your spreadsheet and different data points. And so you've got numerical data, and maybe for some things are grouped into categories, like the first language of these students learning English as a second language, whether their first language is Korean or Spanish or French or whatever categories. But it's structured, and it's something you could then plug into statistics software for statistical analysis. That's structured data. Now, the data might be unstructured data. It might be not something you can put into a spreadsheet to analyze easily, but it's going to be in a more unstructured form where you can analyze things kind of more holistically by looking at it. That might be recorded conversations or transcripts of conversations. It might be texts. It might be videos, audio recordings. It could be observational data. You've taken detailed observational notes of what people do in a certain type of situation. So you have detailed notes, but it's not something that goes immediately into a spreadsheet. That's unstructured data. And the way that you analyze those kinds of data are going to be really different, depending on the field or subfield that you're in And that's going to affect the kind of writing that you do, the kind of analysis and the writing as a result. Take some examples. If you're in literature, you might be asking questions like, well, how does this poet use metaphor in her poetry? Or what influenced this writer's use of metaphor in her poetry? Or the way that this writer develops characters in her stories. You're going to just basically look at the objects of study themselves, the poems, the short stories of these writers, and compare things, use some kind of literary theory to guide you in analyzing the object of your study. That is theoretical research. Likewise, in a more philosophical approach, philosophical questions like philosophical debates about ethics and a number of other kinds of abstract questions that one deals with in philosophy. You're going to maybe think of hypothetical examples and use those for analysis and comparison, or take philosophical approaches to language. Let's say in grammar theory X, how do we explain these types of direct object structures in this language? Well, you might just, if you know the language, you might just come up with examples from your own head and then contrast and compare and analyze them. Or if you're talking about meaning as a philosophical approach to semantics, just think of different expressions and how the meaning arises, and kind of thinking of different hypothetical situations to analyze. That's theoretical research. Now you might get into more unstructured kind of data if you look at like sample conversations or texts of how people use such grammar structures. That would be more unstructured data, and that's more empirical, and that's going to be different. The way you analyze and write it up is going to be very different than if you're just taking a theoretical approach by pulling sentences or word examples from your head and putting them on paper. Let's take a historical approach. A historian interested in linguistics might say, well, how did these languages get here? Where did they come from? You might look at historical data of the language, going back in time to find as many old examples of the language as you can to piece together the history of the language or languages. That's kind of unstructured data that you're using for more of what we call qualitative analysis. And I'll talk more about the term qualitative in a later video. Let's say you're approaching language from more of a sociological or anthropological point of view. You might say, okay, how do speakers of this language categorize color terms? That's something that linguists have dealt with. It could be more unstructured data. You just observe and ask speakers of the language, and you're going to collect more unstructured data from interviewing them, or you could actually do like experiments with people and have them categorize different kinds of colors. It's more structured data. You could ask, for example, how and why do speakers of this language use particular language forms to express formality? Again, you could do interviews with them, or collect a bunch of sample sentences from conversations that you record. That's more unstructured data, and then you try and analyze that. Or you could maybe have them fill out some kind of survey questions where they say, yes, no, I would use it in this situation, or surveys where they have to give fixed answers. That could be more structured data. How do speakers of, this language view people who speak dialect forms of the language? You could collect more unstructured data by interviewing people about their attitudes, or structured data with surveys where they have to categorize things or say yes or no, or rate something on a scale of 1 to 5. Education. You could ask questions like, what would be a better way of teaching this grammar form to students learning this as a second language? And questions like, how do learners understand this grammar form? Do they really understand it? You could look at, say, test scores and test results before and after lessons. That would be more structured data that you can analyze. Or you could just ask them questions. Do you feel like you're understanding? How do you feel about this? Uh, open. You're going to seek open-ended responses from maybe students and record entire sentences or conversations that they say, or maybe they write down open-ended questions to a survey. Open-ended, like it's not like yes or no or 1 to 5, but kind of letting them write or speak kind of freely, and you collect that. That's unstructured data. Would method 1 or 2 be better for teaching this? Probably you're going to maybe do classroom experiments and collect test scores or some kind of results before and after and compare that. That's structured data. That's more, so we're getting more into empirical kinds of data, empirical research with structured or unstructured data. Is this educational program effective? Is it meeting its intended goals? Well, you could collect more structured data looking at test scores and results, or you could have more unstructured kind of data where you interview people and ask open-ended questions, and you kind of on your own take kind of some kind of criteria that are out there for evaluating this program and kind of logically analyze different aspects of the program. Does it work? Does it meet these criteria? That's kind of more unstructured data. Could even be a little bit theoretical if you're using some kind of criteria and applying them. Let's move to more psychological examples. In what order do children learn the grammatical forms of this language? Maybe you're going to collect kind of structured data or maybe unstructured data, more likely structured data because you want to test this scientifically. Do people learn better with learning method or teaching method A or B? You could compare test scores, but you could also ask them for open-ended responses. More structured examples. How do Chinese speakers process the semantic and phonetic contents of Chinese characters when they read text? In case you don't know, Chinese characters have kind of semantic or meaning-related components, but many of them also have phonetic cues, kind of hints from other characters that are embedded in there. And so you could do like laboratory experiments with them reading characters and their reading times and collect a lot of structured data. Which parts of the brain are used for processing particular language functions? You're probably going to do lab experiments and collect a lot of structured data for empirical analysis. So some questions you might want to approach through theoretical analysis, just looking at the object itself, the word meanings or the literature forms, and just look at that itself, the object of study itself, guided by your intuition, your observations, and maybe some kind of theory within the field that you work with. In many other fields, you might rely on empirical research. And maybe if you're writing college papers, you're not going to go out and do your own empirical studies. You're not going to collect your own empirical data, but you're going to be reading papers and evaluating papers by scholars, by researchers who have done empirical research of their own. So it's important for you to understand how this stuff works so that you can intelligently read these papers and cite them in your college papers when you write an essay for your college classes. So this stuff is going to affect how you write the papers. Empirical papers tend to be somewhat more structured, not just the data, but the papers themselves will tend to follow a bit more of a structure, especially if you're working with very structured data, doing scientific analyses. The forms of the research papers that you read are going to be very structured, not just the data, but the papers. Again, like, introduction, lit review, or literature review, where you examine the past research, then a very, very detailed description of the experiment that was done and the results, and then the discussion where the researchers talk about and explain the results and what it means. Those papers are highly structured, and if you're writing a research paper for your college class, you also might write a paper of your own that's similarly structured, where you do a lit review and then you kind of critique them and come up with your own kind of ideas based on that. So the kind of research questions that researchers ask will affect the type of data that they use, the type of analysis that they do, the kind of support that's in the body paragraphs of those papers, the kind of objectives or purposes for which the papers are written, and the audience, the type of audience for which they are written. And maybe if you're interested in further studies in your field, maybe you want to ask, okay, what appeals to you? If you're trying to decide on, okay, what to study further in your studies, maybe your third or fourth year of college, or maybe you want to go on for a master's degree or a PhD, what do you think appeals to you more? Do you think you like the theoretical stuff? Do you think you like the empirical stuff? Do you think you would like working with more unstructured kind of data and kind of just analyzing it according to theory, some kind of theory or model or framework, and comparing data and kind of finding categories in the data? That's what you do with unstructured data. Or do you want like really scientific structured data and do statistical analysis? Does that appeal to you? This is why this stuff is important. And in my next video, I'm going to go more into detail into the research approaches that are based on these different kinds of data. So I hope you stick around for that. See you later. Bye.